We had a few too many people on board.
You know, there's been a flurry of activity in Washington. I want to dive into that in a little while, but first, I want to welcome you to a borough that has 2.3 million people, half of which are immigrants. And a great many people in this borough are very concerned about the climate of fear perpetuated by the Trump administration. We had a pizza delivery guy here in New York who was arrested while delivering pizzas. We have children who are in school at this very moment who are afraid, will my parents be home? Will they be arrested by ICE? If elected, Mayor Buttigieg, what would you do to bring that level back down?
First of all, we've got to recognize that actually, first of all, thanks a lot for having me. I really appreciate it. I didn't want you to think I only knew how to go to one borough when we come to
Is this your first time in Queens?
No, but
Okay.
I'm looking forward to more.
Okay.
So, this immigration is such an important part of how this country was built.
Yeah.
Almost everyone, except for the First Nations, was either brought here against their will or arrived here at some point, the way my father did, who came to this country because of the educational opportunities here, like so many students at this college, and then fortunately decided to become an American and went through that process.
Your father came from?
Yeah, he came from Malta.
Malta.
We had a really? Oh, that's awesome. The Maltese vote's not a big one, so whenever I'm excited. And I was looking for the flag in that hall of flags there, see if I can spot Malta there. Look, this is an engine of growth for our country, and we need to show that we honor it, but more importantly, in terms of the practical chilling effect of the current climate on immigration, we've got to take that weight off of the backs of so many hardworking people, families, children, people who this is the only country they know, but they don't have the documentation to show it, even though they're as American as the rest of us. Yeah. The thing that frustrates me about the immigration issue is this. If leadership consists of taking a divisive issue that nobody can agree on and bringing people together around it, what we have right now is the very opposite of that. The opposite of leadership. Because what we have now is actually, as divisive as this issue can be, we actually have an American consensus, or at least an American majority, when it comes to what to do. The idea of a bipartisan immigration reform is well understood. We need protections for dreamers, including a pathway to citizenship. We need for the 11 million, at least people who are already here, a pathway to citizenship for them too. We need to simplify and clear up the lawful immigration process, like what my father went through, to reduce the bureaucracy and to add resources. So, for example, there are enough people able to adjudicate these asylum claims so that people aren't caught up waiting for work. And then, as part of a compromise, we can have border security as part of that too. We know what that basic compromise looks like, and Washington can't deliver. Why? Well, it turns out that even though if they wanted to, this White House could lead the way on a bipartisan immigration reform, and it would be an achievement. Immigration is actually more useful to them as a crisis, unsolved, than it would be as an achievement if they actually took care of it. Because the division for them, the divisiveness among Americans, to this White House is a feature, not a bug. It's one of the reasons they want immigration to be in the headlines. So the biggest thing, in addition to these very clear policy steps we have to take, not to mention the fact that we must stop the policy of family separation right away. These policy steps need to be taken, but it's also a cultural and moral leadership of a president recognizing that immigration is a huge part of what makes America great.
Right, we talked about your dad, and my condolences, your father passed away in January. What would he think about your run for president? Did you talk to him about your presidential aspirations?
Yeah, so we launched the exploratory committee. It was actually the same week that he passed. It was I was weighing whether to travel. We had a meeting of the U.S. Conference of Mayors in Washington, and I was weighing whether to take that trip or cancel it because he was in very tough shape health-wise. But he made it clear that he wanted me to
You
go.
did want you to.
And when I came back, that was on a Wednesday. I came back the next day. All he wanted to hear about was the announcement. By Sunday, we had lost him. But my father is somebody who really wanted this country to live up to its ideals. I think because he chose citizenship, he was also very, very alive to all of the ways in which the country had fallen short of its own promise. He came to this country by way of New York, by the way. Tried to raise me to be a Mets fan. With
You're in Mets territory right now.
Went to Binghamton, and then wound up in Indiana because there was a job for him at Notre Dame. But he was somebody who really just had that moral energy. We were not a politically connected family growing up, but we were certainly politically aware. And I'd like to think I carry a piece of that with me.
Okay, well, let's talk about what's happening right now in the nation's capital. Democrats, Speaker Pelosi, they're really grappling with this issue of impeaching President Trump.
Yes.
What's your take on that?
So I think it's been clear for some time that this president deserves to be impeached. That much is obvious. The question now is strategically, what's the House supposed to do? They have these powers, these tools, but they also have the knowledge that unfortunately don't have a lot of people in the Senate, Republican caucus, who think for themselves. What's disappointing is we know that there are a lot of senators, Republican senators, who are horrified by the corruption, by the self-dealing, by the dishonesty. But while they're horrified by that as people, they, as politicians, are terrified by the idea of getting crosswise with this president, so they're not going to act. And unfortunately, that political calculation in a place like Washington threatens to take over. What we know is that the rule of law needs to be defended. We have a president who is flouting legitimate investigative requests, instructing people to defy subpoenas, withholding lawfully sought information. There's no question that the rule of law needs to be upheld by somebody, and the House can seek to do it through investigations and through other proceedings. But what I also am conscious of is I'm not part of the House. I'm part of the 2020 process.
Right.
And the thing that I think would put all those Republican legislators back in touch with their conscience would be a tremendous political cost to staying on board with this presidency, and that could be delivered in the form of a huge electoral defeat for this president in 2020, which is the part, of course, that I'm working on trying to deliver.
Right, but the blowback, are you concerned that if an impeachment went forward, that it would galvanize his base even more?
I think that his base is what it is. They are energized, and look, even if you're on board now, I'm not talking about people who might consider voting for him. I'm talking about his base, the people who are they got the red hats and they're ready to go. If you're with them now, what else could possibly come along that's going to make you change your mind? As a matter of fact, even if there were things that might have made you change your mind, the fact that you've come along this far, I think, means that you're pretty much stuck. This, by the way, is how radicalization works. You take one more step when you maybe know better, and then you take one more step, and then they lead you to take one more step. And pretty soon, the only people who respect you are the people who are in that boat with you. So when we figure out how to reverse that pattern of radicalization, that's going to take a lot of work. But in the meantime, I think there is a large middle. I'm talking about people like the people where I live in South Bend, Indiana, where there are a lot of people who voted for Barack Obama and Donald Trump and Governor Mike Pence and me, which means they are not all about party loyalty. They really voted to burn the house down, and that's what we got. But I think that if they have the right alternative and a focus on how we're going to make their lives better, then there is an opportunity for a lot of those people to come back to their prior habit of voting Democratic.
Yeah. Well, you're in Queens now, and we all saw you on the Fox Town Hall. What do you make of President Trump's tactics, the name calling? I know you said you didn't care, but you're in Queens now. You could speak freely. He called you. He called you a Harvard grad, a Rhodes Scholar, a proud member of our military, a veteran, the Navy, and he attempted to reduce you to a caricature from Mad Magazine.
Yeah. I don't see the resemblance at all. I don't know.
But
Look,
I,
this
listen,
is- yeah,
what,
this is-
how do you really, honestly?
This is
respond
his
to-
specialty, right?
Yeah.
And I think the thing you gotta remember is the same as when you're in an interpersonal interaction with maybe somebody you don't care for, or maybe somebody you love who's just mad. And they say something that is designed to get under your skin.
Mhm.
And you have a decision over how much power to give them. And my decision is not to let him have that kind of power. And this is really important for the Democratic Party as a whole, because it's going to take unbelievable discipline as all of this craziness goes on over there, right? Not to have our eyes drawn over there. Because what's going on over there is horrible. It's insulting. It's wrong. And yet we've got to find a way to name it for what it is, resist wrongdoing, correct lies, and yet not let it distract us from the core of what we're trying to do, which is not about him, it's about you. And if we're talking about him, we're not talking about him. So there's this play to get our attention, right? But the thing about attention that goes to him is, even if that attention comes in the form of criticism, it's like food. He just eats it and just gets bigger. And so we got to starve the beast a little bit.
Well, you know, you were the only mayor in this race of nearly 24 candidates. Our mayor just tossed his hat in the ring last week. And I'm trying to read your eyes with that. Do you know Bill de Blasio?
American mayors get to know each other fairly well. We have
Through
a very active
conferences,
U.S.
yeah.
conference of
Right.
mayors, and look, I think that it's not my place to comment on any of my competitors, especially with 24 of us who would take too long. But what I will say is that I do think it's a good time for mayors to be stepping up. I know this is not conventional. You're used to people who've been in Washington for a long time. That's the traditional route. But I think that in cities, and obviously I believe there's a particular perspective that comes from a city in the industrial Midwest. It's exactly the kind of place that this president targeted with this message of nostalgia and resentment. But just more broadly, to have local leaders getting into the mix, I think isn't a bad thing. And also having lots of people getting into the mix. I know there's some anxiety about what this will do to the party.
Right.
And it's very important that we all come home in the end. But in the meantime, at this moment that everything's so scrambled, that I think of it as being kind of like on one of those blank pages between chapters in the American story, and that's why it's hard to read. That it's really important that there be a diversity of opinions. In so many ways, this is the most diverse presidential field ever, and I'm proud to be part of that. And so the more the merrier, because the process has a way of winnowing things down.
Yeah, well, Mayor de Blasio is calling him con Don as a method of fighting fire with fire. So you're saying that you will never engage President Trump with any name calling or tweeting or anything like that?
I'll engage him to the extent that when he does something wrong, it needs to be called out. And when he says something false, we need to respond by presenting the truth. But I don't want to I don't want to go on his show. And I think a lot of times when we're in this
What do you
mode
mean by go on his show?
well, when we're thinking up, like, what's the thing that's going to get under the president's skin? What's the thing that's going to really what's the zinger that's going to knock him flat in the debate, right? And we've all done it. We've all imagined what we would do on that stage, right? But when we're in that mode, it takes us to a place where it's almost as if he's the one we're trying to impress. Where to me, if he's going to call me a silly name, that's him bidding to get my attention. And I'm not going to give it to him, except where necessary to correct the record, because he doesn't do it.
Mayor Buttigieg, how much stock do you put in polls? A Quinnipiac poll came out last night that put you at around 5%. It put Joe Biden at the top, and it showed you losing a little ground. Do you care what polls say?
Yeah, the polls are very important when they have me doing well. And, I think they give you some indication of what level of name recognition you have, and you can track them a little bit, but they really are only telling you much, literally 10 to 15 days out from the vote. Until then, they're largely just reflective of whether people have heard of you and what they feel in kind of a broad sense, especially, again, with so many competitors. What's compelling to us is that we've managed to emerge in many of these measures substantially ahead of people who are much more famous, people who have been at this much longer. Somebody pointed out to me that my dogs actually have more followers now than I did when we started. When we started this exploratory committee. So the fact that we've been able to, I think, become part of that top tier is very meaningful. But there's going to be so many ups and downs between. Right. This is a marathon.
This is a marathon.
I mean, just to get to Iowa is the better part of a year, and that's just the beginning. So we try not to get too caught up in it. Other than that, it's encouraging to see that the more people do learn what we're doing, the more they seem to be fun.
Last night, all across this nation, including here in New York City, there were large crowds of people rallying against the states that have banned abortion. And how do you characterize these states that are doing this?
Well, I characterize them as hostile to American freedom in this decision. And I was at yesterday at the Supreme Court. We had an action, and there have been actions around the country on this. And I think it is particularly important in the political space for men to be standing up.
Why?
Well, first, because it's the right thing to do. Second, because whenever somebody's freedom is being suppressed, you never know if you're going to be met. I think there's a moment right now where the White House has succeeded in dividing us in so many different ways. I shouldn't have to be a woman to stand up for women's reproductive freedom. Just like you don't have to be gay to defend my marriage, and I shouldn't have to be a person of color to insist on making sure that we have justice and equity. All of this fits together. And in a country, and look, I'm from Indiana. Mm-hmm. I get people that I know, some of my supporters do not share my pro-choice views. And I get where that's coming from. But at the end of the day, this is a decision that a woman has to make. If she seeks spiritual guidance, that's her choice. If she needs medical advice, that makes sense. But the idea that that decision would be better, medically or morally, because a government comes in and dictates it, well, to me, that runs against not just our progressive values, but conservative values too. I know they don't see it that way. But to me, it's an example of why we can't just allow freedom to be talked about like it's just a conservative idea. Because right now, we're talking about a very basic, very important freedom. And standing up for freedom, in my view, includes making sure that women have the freedom to make these decisions on their own.
Right, and so many people feel so many people at this point fear, legitimately so, that Roe v. Wade could be overturned. You have a plan for reforming the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. Tell us about that.
So, you look at the trajectory of the Supreme Court, and I really fear that it's on the road toward being seen as a nakedly political institution. And the whole idea of the Supreme Court is that we have a branch of government that stands apart from the everyday kind of rough and tumble give and take of democratic politics. And yet now, every time we have a vacancy, there's this apocalyptic ideological firefight. Justices used to retire. Now they hang on and try to be strategic about when they retire or pass away to make sure it's during a favorable presidency. And it's just gone off the rails. And so what I think we need to do is consider a structure. The Supreme Court structure, or at least size, has changed several times. The number 9 is actually not in the Constitution. And so one proposal that I think is very interesting would be to have 15 justices.
15?
15, but this is a really important feature. It's not just about the number.
Okay.
10 of them can be chosen through the traditional political mechanism like we have now. But 5 of them can only be seated, can only be selected, if there's a unanimous agreement among the other 10. And so the idea is you get more of the justices who think for themselves, more of the Souters, more of the Kennedys. Now there's an article coming out in a law journal about how you can do this. Some people think you'd have to have an amendment. Some people think you don't. I'm not a legal scholar. I'll leave that to the legal scholars. This may not even be the exact right reform, but I'm floating it so that I can help remind people of how ambitious we ought to be. One of the best things about America is that we can adjust our structures. It's the most elegant quality of our Constitution, is that it's designed to be amended. And when something as important as the condition of our republic is at stake, I think we should be open to structural reforms. And to some people, this is radical. But to me, it's not any more radical than what has happened in the Senate. In fact, I would argue the Senate Republicans changed the number of justices on the Supreme Court. They changed it to 8 until they took the presidency, and then they changed it back to 9. And so let's talk about something that is designed not to make the court more progressive because it's become too conservative, although it has, in my view, become too conservative, but to make it less politicized and something we can all trust.
Yeah, and you also have the unique idea about the Electoral College.
Yeah, it's pretty simple, which is that it's got to go.
Why do you say it's got to go?
Well, we want to think of ourselves as a democratic society. And we have stood up for the value of democracy around the world. And it's a big part of what America represents. And yet, one of the basic properties of a democracy is you get to choose your leader.
Right.
So when we're choosing the leader of this country, why wouldn't we just add up all the votes and give it to the woman or man who got the most votes? In fact, the only principled argument, look, also the history of the Electoral College is pretty complicated, pretty dark. It's not unrelated to slavery. One of the more convincing justifications that we still had was this idea that if somehow, by some freakish electoral dynamic, the American people ever selected somebody who was just clearly, manifestly unfit to be the American president, then the Electoral College would step in and save the day, right? I think we can rule that. We can rule that out. The principle that I think is at stake is everybody ought to count the same. Because I live in a very conservative state that is reliably Republican, because you live in a very state that is reliably Democratic, your votes and mine don't count. Rural voters in Indiana, urban voters in Queens, basically most years nobody even bothers to campaign for our votes in the general election for the presidency. And some people say, well, this is going to make some states worse off. But states don't vote, people do. And states don't have interests in the way that people have interests. If you were in one of the states that does get a lot of attention in the Electoral College because you're considered a swing state, let's say you're in in the spirit of saying the same thing to every audience, I raised this issue in the town hall in New Hampshire. I'm not sure everybody in New Hampshire thinks this is good for their state because they get more attention than most states their size because they're a swing state. But if you live in New Hampshire, the only concrete impact that the Electoral College has had on your life is that twice it's overruled the American people in my lifetime. And so in terms of your wages or your access to health care, those are the things that have changed in your life because the Electoral College was there, not how many times you showed up on that big map on TV on election.
Let's talk a little bit about your record as mayor in South Bend, Indiana. How many people live there?
About 100,000.
100,000. And one of your big initiatives about 5 years ago, 1,000 houses in 1,000 days.
Yep.
And why don't you tell us how that went? Because you were dealing with the breakdown of a neighborhood that you saw turn into a blight because of the lack of commerce and businesses moving out. We deal with that too here in New York, especially Long Island City, where now we're gentrified and we have neighborhoods that we can no longer afford to live in. So tell us about your 1,000 houses, 1,000 days, how it went.
Great. So when I was first running for office, I was knocking on a lot of doors. Mm-hmm. We didn't just say, you ought to vote for me. We also asked questions. We said, okay, what do you think we ought to be focusing on? And the issue I heard again and again, especially on the west side of our city, which is the lower income side, was, what are you going to do about these boarded up houses? Right. Now, I got to understand, you may have heard of South Bend because of this university and football team that's in our city, but one thing you got to understand about our city is that we're an auto industry town. The university is actually outside of the city limits.
Right. Studebaker was
Studebaker, exactly. We were a company town for Studebaker. Yeah. A huge employer, making cars, and then it collapsed in the 60s. And we lost about a quarter of our population. And so there were empty factories, empty houses all around me growing up. I didn't even realize it was unusual until later, and I went away to school and saw other communities. And so when I talked to residents, especially in the west side, and especially residents of color. The issue I so often heard was, there's this house next to me, it's collapsing, or it's been vacant for years, but people are using it as a waypoint for drug activity, and it's destroying the value of my home. What are you going to do about it? And so we decided that we could wire up enough funding, take federal money, take local money, raise some community funds, and deal with 1,000 houses in 1,000 days. Save the ones we could. We were able to save about 400 of them. Often because there was an out-of-town landlord that we just had to get their attention with some enforcement action. But also tearing a lot of them down,
Right.
which you hate to do, but if it's collapsing and it's ruining the safety of the neighborhood, then you've got to act. And by day 1,000, we'd acted on 1,100 houses and stabilized a lot of these neighborhoods. Now, this is one thing where I think it's an example of how different housing dynamics are in different parts of the country. So this will not maybe be a familiar problem to people searching for real estate in Queens. But the issue we have now is a lot of times we'll have a vacant lot, and it may be 10 or 15 years before anybody's ready to build on it. That's kind of the opposite of the gentrification dynamics that you would see
Right.
close to an economic center where there's a lot of activity. So what we're trying to do is encourage neighbors will take it on as a side lot sometimes, or we can have a community garden there or something. But believe it or not, we have some properties where I've been told that they've become unaffordable because the price went too low. And that sounds strange, I know, but where we live, in these neighborhoods, you get a pretty good house for $30,000 or $40,000.
Right, and in your book,
By the way, y'all should move over.
and in your book, Shortest Way Home, you say your mortgage payment is $450.
Yeah, about $450.
His mortgage payment is $450.
Yeah, but if you add in the taxes and the interest, then it's more like $800.
You can't get a studio for
No,
that.
it's like a parking. It's like a parking place.
Exactly.
Which again, you
it's a
should
parking
move to
spot.
Indiana. We got plenty of room. The president says the U.S. is full. South Bend's not full. We got enough firehouses and streets for 30,000 more people than we have, and I'd love to have 30,000 more taxpayers helping us to fund it all. So come on down. But to that point, so these houses, the reason a house can be unaffordable, relatively low price is that a lot of banks don't think it's worth it to lend at that level. And so it's this weird version of kind of like redlining. They're just making, or they say they're just making a business decision. But for a credit-worthy, low-income family in our community, it may not be possible. Even if they're willing to fix one of these houses with their own hands, they have trouble accessing it. And so we're trying to figure out how we can help people access housing at the same time.
So I'm going to have my executive producer, David Wharton, come up, and we're going to entertain questions from our wonderful audience. But as he comes, what in your experience as mayor has prepared you to be president?
Great question. So, again, I get this is not a traditional background.
Yeah, we're just chatting.
But I think it's a really helpful one. And everybody arrives in the Oval Office without personal experience of what it is to be president, but some combination of personal experiences they do have that have educated them along the way. And three parts to the job that you learn when you're a mayor that are the same, I think, for any executive leadership position in government. One, implementing good policy, of course. That's the part you hear about the most. Two, capably managing an administration, right? Everything from water works to police and fire to officers, just running an administration. And then third, the part that gets talked about the least, and is probably the most important, is the moral and intangible part of it. The part of the job that just has to do with calling people to their highest values. And when a community comes under strain, you need that part of the mayor's job in order to bring people together. So a mayor's job changes hour by hour. 1 minute you're in some kind of economic development negotiation with a developer, and you're trying to figure out whether they're telling the truth when they say they can create this many jobs with that $1 million. And then you'll be in something right out of Parks and Recreation. Like we have an epic controversy going on right now over a duck pond and moving this duck pond. And then just when you're having a good laugh about that, that's when you find out about a racially explosive officer-involved shooting, and you got a matter of hours. Yeah, or things like that. You got to get on television. You got to try to draw people together.
Yeah.
And you may not even have all the facts.
Right.
And you learn what's at stake in those moments. And sometimes the mayor literally gets the 3 a.m. call. We've had it for natural disasters in our city, An airplane crashed into a neighborhood. We had to figure out what to do. And so you learn all of the different parts of government in all of its richness and complication and comedy and frustration and challenge in a way that I think is as good a preparation as you can get at a time when I think we're hoping that we can get Washington to start looking a little more like our best run cities and towns before the opposite starts happening.
Okay, well, we have a very interesting question from Sam, and it's something that happened right here in Long Island City. Amazon. You've heard of Amazon. Pulled out of a deal to create their second headquarters right here in this town of 47,000. How do you feel about the balance between economic incentives for development versus other tax uses?
Yeah.
You heard about this whole drama
Right.
that happened here. Yeah.
Right. So the way we do it at home is economic development incentives have a place. Sometimes I'm trying to offer something that would be the tiebreaker between our community and somewhere else. Or more appropriately, somebody wants to build something, but I want to get them to do it in a way that would be better for the community. So we're going to offer an incentive, but we're going to have some strings attached to make sure there's a public benefit. But it's very important that we know what we're getting for those incentives. That there be a benefit in terms of equity or in terms of community that comes with it. And if we lose sight of that, then we could actually be disinvesting in the things that make a community competitive. So the thing we often forget is companies are made of people. And at least in my experience in South Bend, when we actually get to that moment when, the person deciding where to locate a headquarters is willing to come have dinner with me and the head of the Chamber of Commerce, and we're selling them on South Bend, right? They've already done the math on land, labor, utilities, taxes, all that stuff. We're in the top few. Right. What they want to know is, what kind of place is this? What does it feel like to live here? Would my kids want to grow up here? Will I have an easier or hard time recruiting employees here? Is this the kind of place I want to be associated with this employer? And it turns out the best way to do that is to invest in safety, in growth, in education, infrastructure, all of those basics that help establish the quality of place that makes somebody want to consider you in the first place. Otherwise, all of those incentives don't get you very far. There has to be a reason that it's a good business decision to come. You can't buy jobs by taking a bad business decision and converting it into a good one. Or else you're going to get the kind of employer that's not very sticky, and 7 years from now, somebody will come along with another incentive package and pick them off and take them somewhere else.
Tom is asking, and Tom is a student here, I believe.
Is Tom here?
Is Tom here?
He is not a student.
Okay. He's
Okay.
Hi, Tom. Okay.
He's a former NYU student.
Huh?
Former NYU student. Well, he says, I now owe nearly $200,000 from student loans that originally only totaled $80,000. Student loan debt can never be erased. Any action a POTUS can take on this, he asks.
Yes. So thanks for sharing that. It's something we're hearing everywhere we go. This is kind of personal for us too, because as a household, we're now in six figures on student debt. I had the benefit of a scholarship that covered my graduate school, but Chasten didn't, and because he made the decision to be a teacher, where he's, after he got his master's, made as much or a little bit less than he did as bartender working to put himself through school. It's a real struggle, but I'll save my teacher pay discussion for another. So, first of all, I think for most Americans, it seems reasonable that if you can refinance a house, if you can refinance other debt, you should be able to refinance student debt too. And at a time like this, when there's the opportunity to have an interest rate that's more reasonable, we would be able to seize hold of that. That's one. Another thing I think that we need to do is look at student debt that was created in bad faith, and hopefully that's not your story. But certainly when I came back from my deployment to Afghanistan, and the internet figured out I was a veteran, my phone got flooded, and my computer searches got flooded with ads for for-profit colleges that knew about some of the benefits I get as a veteran. And many of these colleges have really harmed people. They've almost turned the Department of Education into a predatory lender. And so we have to ask if the Department of Education, maybe with the best of intentions, set up a program that's now been used in a way that's made people worse off. Shouldn't those be first in line for some of that debt to be cleared away? Third thing we got to do, of course, is to actually act on the front end to make education less expensive to begin with. And that means a state-federal partnership to make sure that less of the cost of college falls on the student. It means expanding Pell Grants in a big way. And this time, let's peg it to inflation so you don't have to go back to Congress every time that you need to get a cost of living adjustment. And take other steps that would help make it affordable. And for low and middle income and first generation students, many of them, I think we can have it to where you leave college debt free. Lastly, I would mention that we have this wonderful public service loan forgiveness program. At least it's wonderful in theory. It says that if you commit some part of your career to public service, you get rewarded for that by having your student loans waived. But in practice, it's almost impossible to access. You have to have a certain number of payments over a certain number of years, and if you're in this kind of loan instead of that kind of loan, it doesn't even count. A frighteningly tiny fraction of people have participated. I would want to make it a much more flexible program, so that no matter where you are in your career, you could earn credit to help that debt be chipped away at through some kind of public service involvement.
Yeah. And Mayor, did you see at Morehouse College, the billionaire
Yes.
announced during the graduation that he was paying off the debt of $400? What do you think of that?
It was very nice of him. But try doing that with $4 million, right? We can't expect.
Is it time to completely wipe out and forgive, though?
Yes.
I'm worried about how we can do that in a way that's fair to people who are struggling or have just paid off their loans. But I do think, especially in these cases where it was unfair to begin with, that we've got to take some action, and that's going to have to include some kind of forgiveness.
Right. Well, here's a story, a question that hits close to home. It happened to you. Our cities are crippled with traffic. Mike Earls from Brooklyn asked, what would you do? Is my hi, Mike. Can you hear me?
Oh.
There you go, Exhibit A. So, as if elected, what would you do to deal with our infrastructure and all the congestion in major cities like New York?
Well, the good news is there's a lot of technology out there that can help. The bad news is we have some governance problems, to put it mildly, when it comes to the way we manage that. Look, we're on the cusp of something that will completely change the way we get around. Automated vehicles, for example, not that far off. A little scary to think about. But you think about how many accidents there are with regular vehicles, we're probably better off in the automated ones. Plus, you can actually enjoy a sandwich, or maybe some people do that anyway when you're driving, but you shouldn't. But the real question, I think, is how much are we prepared to invest in mobility for people, whether it is in a vehicle, whether it is in good, quality, safe, effective public transportation, and other means of getting around. This, of course, has huge implications for our sustainability, for climate, for carbon, but it's also got huge implications for equity. One of the things we're piloting in South Bend, because we got a lot of low-income workers who are in a kind of a poverty trap, where they can't afford a vehicle. They're often shift workers at maybe a distribution facility or a warehouse that's on the edge of town, so it's not easily on a bus route. And they got an unreliable cousin with an unreliable car, and every once in a while that cousin lets them down, and they could lose their job. And so what we realized is we ought to ask employers to help and start treating transportation as a benefit. So we, the city, are helping. We're asking the employers to do it too. We ran a pilot. We got some philanthropic money to do it from Bloomberg Philanthropy. And it worked. 80% of the people who participated in this program said that they worked more hours and earned more money, which helps them get out of that poverty trap. But the other thing we found is that because there's less occasions when a worker is absent or late, the employers liked it a lot too. So now we're moving to that next step, which is to see just how much employers are willing to put in financially for that. But we think it's a very promising model. And we need to understand that transportation isn't just about planes and ships, it's about the basics of moving around a city. And while we think of that as a local issue, and it is, we need a federal government that will help local authorities, local entities, make it possible for everybody to get around, especially when we have housing costs, which is another whole separate problem, but that force people to commute such a long distance just to be able to put food on the table.
Wow. This next question comes from Heather, and she's asking, if elected, how would you improve the public education system? Do you think teachers get paid enough?
I don't. Is that in here?
Yeah, over here.
Hi. Are you a teacher or?
No, but I've served on my school leadership team,
Oh,
both
great.
my kids' elementary and now middle
Well,
school.
thanks for being involved.
No problem. Glad to.
So, all right, step one, get a Secretary of Education who believes in public education. Sometimes personnel is policy. Another thing we got to do, look, there's no question that there's a lot of steps we can take to modernize education at a time when the workforce is changing, our relationship to knowledge is changing. Look, a lot of our educational practices were designed in the 19th century to teach knowledge, when now more and more knowledge is at your fingertips. And so things like social and emotional learning and critical thinking and other things are becoming more important. And we've got to have some very smart, forward-thinking, sophisticated approaches to that. But sometimes we overthink a problem that there's some really basic pieces, like we got to invest more, and we got to pay teachers more, and we got to respect teachers more. Look, we can't expect people to continue going into this profession, this incredibly important profession that I hope a lot of people here are studying in hopes of becoming part of. We can't expect people to keep entering it if we don't honor it. I heard a great story from Japan, from someone who hosts exchange students in our community. They had a Japanese high school student. Her career dream was she wanted to be a teacher. And so they kept in touch with her after she went back to Japan to see what happened to her. And she went back to Japan. She took the entrance exam to become a teacher, or to go into the college program to get trained to become a teacher. And she came up just short. She's very bright, but not quite good enough academically to get into that program to become a teacher. So she did what a lot of people, I'm told, in Japan will do as a fallback if you don't qualify to become a teacher. She became a doctor. Which shows you just how much respect in that society that profession has. And that starts with pay. Now, I think when we have federal support for teacher pay grants, it would also make sense to prioritize Title I schools to receive those grants. Because we also know that having the most qualified teachers has a big impact on the lifelong earnings of the classroom. My policy lead, who advises us on a lot of this, is a professor who did research using people's IRS data. And they measured how much of a difference it makes across a kindergarten classroom for the rest of their lives that they had a great teacher versus an average teacher. And in terms of their earnings, the difference is about $300,000 per teacher per classroom. Obviously not what teachers are getting paid. I'm not saying they have to make that much, but certainly it's got to be better than it is today.
Right. Next question comes from Jennifer. My husband suffers from MS and is a cancer survivor. Tell me what you would do to ensure quality health care for my family and funding for research.
Great. Is Jennifer with us? Okay. Thank you. So it is, first of all, these are pre-existing conditions. So we're playing defense right now because whether they'll admit it or not, and despite the efforts of Congressman Meeks and everybody else in Congress on our side trying to defend the ACA, they are going after that, and they're trying to take it away. So we need to make sure that we stand firm for protections for pre-existing conditions, but I don't think that's enough. We got to make sure that health care is affordable and accessible for everybody. We just had the experience you mentioned of losing my father. It was a terminal illness, and as wrenching as the family decisions we had to make were, we also did not have to ask if our family was going to be bankrupt. Not because we're wealthy, we're not. Because of Medicare. Because of a policy decision to make sure that past a certain age you ought to be free from fear that these kinds of conditions will break you financially. Now, even if you're on Medicare, there's a lot of gaps there, including the availability of affordable prescription drugs. But at least you have that kind of coverage. I want every American to enjoy that kind of freedom. It's why we need universal health care. And To me, the best pathway to get there is through what I would call a Medicare-for-All who want it proposal. In other words, you take something like Medicare, you put it on the exchanges, you allow people to opt into it, and my expectation is it will beat out all the corporate options. But it's also a way to dare the corporate options one last time to come up with something that's more affordable. And if they don't, too bad. And if they do, great. But we also clearly need to act. We can't wait for that to act on the prescription drug side. And it's why we need to have circuit breakers, that if somebody's price gouging, we step in and act. It's why we need to allow Medicare to negotiate drug prices, which will benefit not just Medicare recipients, but all of us through secondary effects. And if there's real misbehavior, which there often is by a pharmaceutical company, then we also have to be willing to say that we will go after a patent as a response to misconduct. That'll get their attention, even more than a fine. And so we got to be willing to go there.
Would you save Obamacare?
Yes, but it's just the beginning.
Just
Look,
the beginning?
here's another thing, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
When we're having this debate over is the Democratic Party going too far left? Obamacare is pretty much the most conservative thing you could have done to healthcare besides just leave it alone completely, right? So if the right-wing thing to do is to just leave it alone, and the left-wing thing to do is to have national health care like they have in England, where the doctors and the insurance, it's all part of the government. Then the compromise is single payer, Medicare-for-All, right? Then you have a private doctor but a public insurance company. If you wanted to go a little more conservative than that, you would have that with the public option in a private marketplace. What's even more conservative than that is the Affordable Care Act, invented by the Heritage Foundation and first piloted by Governor Romney in Massachusetts, right? So, and that was as far as the president could get in the Congress that he had. And it saved lives. It probably will save millions of lives. It's saving my mother-in-law's life. It's how she gets chemotherapy right now. And as soon as it was named after a Democratic president, suddenly this conservative idea was communist. It was death panel. It was the end of the free market system in America, right? According to our friends on Fox News and the radical right. And the message is, whatever we do, they're going to call us crazy socialists. So we might as well just do the right thing and let them call it whatever they want.
Before we let you go, and we appreciate your time, we know time is short. If elected, you would be the youngest president ever. You're 37.
Yes.
And you'd be the first openly gay president. Which president do you most admire that you would take their experience into the White House with you on day one?
Well, there's a lot to think about. A lot of presidents to think about. Some of the youngest presidents like Kennedy and Teddy Roosevelt, both did remarkable things. And I think the fact that they came from a new generation,
Right.
in both cases, was very much a part of their style and their government strategy.
And you'd be the first millennial.
That's right. Yeah, about time, right? By the way, interestingly, so I'd be 39 when I took office. That's
Oh, you've got this all calculated.
worth noting. No, but it's interesting because there's been a global trend in this direction. So that's the same age as the president of France. It's actually older than this magnificent leader, the Prime Minister of New Zealand. She was amazing after she passed. So you have the emergence of a new generation in global leadership. The frustrating thing is usually that's exactly the kind of thing America would lead. And for whatever reason, we're not on the forefront of this one. But I think we could be, and I'm here to help. I certainly think you can learn a lot from the way that, as far as the historic quality of arriving as the first out person to run, even though it's very different in very many ways. I do admire the way that President Obama was very clearly aware of what he represented historically, and also found a way to speak to people of all different backgrounds. But the president I think about most is Lincoln, because so much of this campaign is about the future. It's about the idea that what we decide in 2020 and what the president does starting in 2021 is going to decide what America looks like in 2054. When I celebrate my retirement and reach the age of the current president. that all traces back to the decisions we make now. And the interesting thing about Lincoln, in addition, of course, to the fact of emancipation and the fact that he guided this country through a civil war, is that he never lost his focus on the future. Of course, we remember him most for the Civil War. But while he was president, we saw the founding of the National Science Foundation, the groundwork of the Transcontinental Railroad, and the land-grant colleges. Because he understood that America's survival depended on preparing it for the future. Can you imagine having the presence of mind when half of the country breaks off and declares war against the other half, to worry about things like the National Science Foundation? It shows that there's this understanding that everything we do projects out into the future. And you can't allow your vision to be focused on any one thing, even when it's an existential crisis. And that kind of vision and forethought and temperament is what I would seek to take into the White House as well. And so I just think you can't beat Lincoln for that kind of leadership.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mayor Pete Buttigieg.